Good morning. The intent of our discussion this week is to take a look at the mechanisms for creep. Specifically, we're talking about dislocation glide, dislocation climb, atomic diffusion, specifically inside grains and along the grain boundaries, and grain boundary sliding. So the first one to take a look at is dislocation glide. Specifically, dislocation glide occurs as the predominant creep mechanism when the stress value over the shear value ratio is less than 10 to the negative second power. Basically, what this tells you is that the stress is going to be relatively high. Additionally, basically beyond the critically resolved shear stress. And also, in terms of temperature, dislocation glide tends to be on the lower side of creep temperatures. Next, we go on to dislocation climb. Dislocation climb, very similar stress conditions to dislocation glide, in that it's also the ratio of the stress to the shear is going to be greater than 10 to the negative second, and also beyond the critical resolved shear stress, so it's going to be pretty high. The difference between dislocation glide and dislocation climb controlling creep is that in the dislocation climb, we're talking about a much higher temperature. Basically, the climbing mechanism requires some thermal activation and some diffusion. So what that tells us is that it's going to be a higher temperature, which causes this to be dominant. And essentially, dislocation climb, it's the primary mechanism for overcoming obstacles in the slip plane, such as a Cottrell Lomer lock. Next, we look at the atomic diffusion inside the grains and along the boundaries. There's two types of creeps for this. There's the Nabarro-Haring creep, which is the creep inside the grains. And then there's also the Coble creep, which is at the grain boundaries. Now, in both cases, the stress values are... and this is going to be when the ratio from the stress to shear is less than or equal to 10 to the negative fourth power. So it's going to be lower than the gliding and climbing. Your stress values are going to be lower than the gliding and climbing conditions. The Nabarro-Haring creep, specifically, it's going to happen at a higher temperature, and the Coble creep is going to be at a lower temperature between the two mechanisms. But the Nabarro-Haring creep is essentially when you have flux vacancies inside the grains which are moving in such a manner that they cause the crystal to elongate, whereas the Coble creep is where you have these vacancies along the grain boundaries, and essentially they move in such a way where they create a shear which increases the length. And as I stated above, the Nabarro-Haring is the primary diffusion controlled for a higher temperature, and the Coble creep is primarily for the lower temperature. Then we have grain boundary sliding. Grain boundary sliding tends to be a contributor of the tertiary creep area, and generally this creep mechanism involves a high stress and a high temperature, but lower strain rates. The high temperatures cause some melting at the grain boundaries, which tend to facilitate this stripping. Understanding of these is used to construct the deformation mechanisms, or the Wortman-Ashby maps. These maps generally show creep with a sigma versus shear or a T versus Tm plot, and these are generally constructed by either choosing a constant strain rate and a varying grain size, or a constant grain size and a varying strain rate. And the two plots are basically broken into 5 areas. You have your plastic flow without dislocations, which is above the theoretical shear, your movement of dislocations by glide, your dislocation creep, which covers the glide and climb, the Nabarro-Haring creep, and the Coble creep. And you can see some of these in the book. Where is it? Shown below.